"I survived the BTK," were the words of Charlie Otero, whose life had just turned upside down. January 15th, 1974, was a bitterly cold morning in Wichita, Kansas. At 15 years old, Charlie Otero had no idea that as he walked home from school that day with two of his other siblings, he was stepping into a nightmare, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first thing Charlie Otero noticed was the dog. Lucky was outside. That wasn't right. He and his siblings had just walked home from school, expecting to find their mother waiting, maybe cooking, their father watching the news maybe, their younger siblings playing. Instead, Lucky was out in the cold, pacing. His stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Charlie went straight to the back door, pushing it open. The house was silent, too silent. He stepped into the kitchen, and that's when he saw it. His mother's purse flipped over on the stove, the things inside scattered everywhere. His mother was meticulous. She never left things like this. "Is anybody home?" he called out. Silence. Then, one of his siblings' voices echoed through the house. "Charlie, come quick! Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." The fear in his chest turned into something sharp. He ran down the hall, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. And then his world ended. His father was on the floor. His mother was on the bed, tied up, unmoving, strangled. It didn't even look like them. Charlie's eyes darted across the room, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His father's head was wrapped in plastic, a belt twisted around his throat. His mother's face was frozen in pain, her body tied up in ropes that penetrated her skin. He didn't realize he was screaming until his throat burned. They ran, out the door, to the neighbor's house, the phone in his shaking hands, the words pouring out in gasps. "Something happened. They're not moving. We need help." The police came. He didn't know how long it took. Time didn't feel real anymore. He was outside when they entered the house, when they found Joey, his little brother, lifeless in another room. And then Josie. She wasn't there. Not in the bedroom, not in the hallway, not anywhere. Until they opened the basement door. Charlie didn't see her. The police wouldn't let him. But they told him later. Josephine, 11 years old, hanging from a pipe. They took him to the station. That's where they told him about Joey and Josie. He didn't remember what he said. He didn't remember if he said anything at all. "I thank God every day that I didn't find them," he would say later, "because I don't know how I would have handled it."
I thank God every day that I didn't find Joey and Josie, because I don't know how I would have handled it.
But even then, even in that moment, he knew. His family was gone, and someone had done this to them, normal, polite, and well-mannered. That's how people described Dennis Rader. A doting husband, a loving father, and an active member of his community, Rader was just another unassuming neighbor in Wichita, Kansas. He attended church, worked a stable job, and blended in seamlessly. But beneath this facade lurked a monster, a predator who thrived in the thrill of power, control, and death. He was the BTK Killer. Bind, torture, kill. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He grew up in Wichita, where he presented himself as an ordinary boy. But behind the friendly exterior, dark urges simmered. As a child, Rader took pleasure in torturing and killing stray animals. He fantasized about power, control, and suffering. He later joined the Air Force, then married Paula Dietz in 1971. Together, they had 2 children. By all accounts, Rader was a normal family man. No one knew that, beneath the surface, he was harboring a desire to kill. That desire erupted in January 1974, when he chose his first victims, the Otero family. He had been watching them for weeks, noting Julie's routines, their home's vulnerabilities. Then, on the morning of January 15th, he made his move. Rader cut the phone lines and waited. Joey, the youngest, opened the back door to let the dog in, and Rader slipped inside. He held the Otero family at gunpoint, feeding them a fabricated story that he was a wanted man from California who only needed food and money. But his true intentions were far more ugly than his made-up story. He forced the family into a bedroom, binding each of them with the ropes he had brought. Joseph Otero Sr. fought back, but Rader overpowered him, securing his wrists and feet. Then, he placed a plastic bag over his head. When Joseph chewed a hole through it, Rader tightened another bag over him, watching as he slowly suffocated. Julie Otero's desperate plea came next. "Please save my son," she begged, referring to Joey. Rader removed the bag for a moment, but it was a cruel illusion of mercy. Moments later, he strangled her to death with a rope. Then came Joey. Rader placed a plastic bag over the 9-year-old's head, followed by 2 T-shirts and another bag. He watched as the child thrashed, gasping for air, until he finally went still. But the worst was yet to come. Josie Otero, 11 years old, had witnessed it all. Now Rader led her to the basement. He tied a noose to a pipe and slipped it around her neck. As he pulled the rope, Josie's feet barely touched the ground. "Mama, Mama," she cried. Her long hair got in his way as she struggled. And then she asked a question that still haunts those who hear it. "What will happen to me?" Rader's response was chilling. "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." He hanged her. He let her toes dangle just above the floor to prolong her suffering as he watched his achievement with utmost satisfaction on his face. Then, as her body went still, he desecrated the scene in the most depraved way imaginable. Dennis Rader evaded capture for 3 decades. When he was finally arrested in 2005, his confession revealed just how twisted his mind was.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that's no, that was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy. These people were selected.
All right, so you
Okay.
you were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see.
During his sentencing, prosecutors presented disturbing evidence, crime scene photos, drawings, trophies he collected from victims, a macabre stash of keepsakes. Rader himself provided a recounting of his crimes very casually, sending chills down the spine of everyone watching, speaking as though he were discussing a hobby.
All right, when you went into the house, what happened then?
Well, I confronted the family, pulled a pistol, confronted Mr. Otero, and asked him to, that I was there to, basically, I was wanted to get the car. I was hungry, food, I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time, I realized that wouldn't be a really good idea, so I finally, the dog was the real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out. So he had one of the kids put it out. And then I took him back to the bedroom.
You took who back to the bedroom?
The family to the bedroom, the 4 members.
All right, what happened then?
At that time, I tied him up.
While still holding him at gunpoint?
Well, in between tying and yes. Yeah. Well, after that, I did Mrs. Otero. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take. But
Was she also tied up there in the
yes,
bedroom?
yeah, both her hands and their feet were tied up. She was on the bed.
Where were the children?
Josephine was on the bed and Junior was on the floor at this time. Basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior, I put him in the bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head, I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies, but that was...
He recalled how he made sure Josie's toes barely touched the ground so she wouldn't die too quickly, how he trained his hands with a squeeze ball to strengthen his grip for strangulation, how he broke into homes disguised as a phone repairman, how he mocked his victims' last words, mimicking their desperate pleas as yada yada yada. In a particularly harrowing moment, Rader admitted that he kept meticulous notes on his victims, listing their roles in his sick fantasies. Josie, he wrote, was my star young maiden that I will teach sex to. The courtroom was silent, except for the sobs of the victims' families. Charlie Otero, now an adult, broke down when he saw a photo of his sister Josie hanging lifeless in the basement, where he had once played as a child. He buried his face in his hands, unable to bear the sight. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, no parole, no escape, just a cell where he would rot for the rest of his miserable life. But for the families of his victims, there was no true closure.
I'm Carmen Julie Otero Montoya. Although we have never met, you have seen my face before. It is the same face you murdered over 30 years ago, the face of my mother, Julie Otero. I will not address you as Mr. Rader because Mr. is a word of respect, as in Mr. Can you help me, not Mr. Are you going to kill me? BTK is how you want to be known, and I will not give you that satisfaction. Rader is an appropriate name for you, as in one who invades a surprise attack. That is nothing to be proud of. Rader, when you took away my mother, you took someone who meant a lot to a lot of people. My mother loved life, her friends, a good laugh, dancing with my dad, and she loved to help people. But most of all, she loved and lived for us, her family. She showed me how to love, to be a good person, to accept others as they are, and most of all, to face your fears. I'm sure you saw that in her face as she fought to live. My mother against your gun, you're such a coward.
As one victim's son put it, what do you expect from a demon? The Otero family were not his only victims. On April 4, 1974, just months after the Otero family murders, Rader struck again. Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman living in Wichita, had no idea that a predator was stalking her. Rader had selected her, watched her, learned her routines. When she left her home that day, he made his move, breaking in through the screen door. But things didn't go according to plan. He hadn't expected her 19-year-old brother Kevin Bright to be there. Rader pulled out his gun and forced Kevin to restrain his sister, handing him a rope he had brought for this very purpose. Then, he took Catherine into another room. She fought him, struggling so much that his usual method of strangulation proved ineffective. Frustrated, he grabbed a knife and stabbed her 3 times in the back and lower abdomen. She bled out, her body giving one final shudder before going still.
If I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. I'm not bragging on that. It's just a matter of fact. It's the bonds I tied him up with that he broke them. So, and that,
All right.
and maybe same with Catherine. It got out of hand.
Meanwhile, Rader attempted to kill Kevin by strangling him and then shooting him in the head. But Kevin refused to die. Clinging to life, he played dead until Rader left. Then, using every ounce of his remaining strength, he managed to escape, running for his life. Unlike the Oteros, Kevin Bright survived. He lived to tell the tale of the man who called himself BTK. But Dennis Rader wasn't finished yet, not even close. On March 17, 1977, Shirley Ruth Relford, who was 25 at the time, was found dead in her Wichita home, the victim of Dennis Rader's twisted fantasies. Rader had stalked her, following her 5-year-old son home to discover their residence. Once inside, he brandished a handgun, the weight of his presence sucking the air from the room. Fear was instant, suffocating. He confined her 3 children, tying them up and locking them in the bathroom. Their muffled cries and frantic pounding on the door did nothing to dissuade him. With precision and what seemed like a lot of practice, he led Relford to the bedroom where sheer terror overwhelmed her, so much so that she vomited. But he didn't care. He bound her legs to the bedpost, restraining her with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before. Then came the plastic bag, stretched tight over her face, followed by the rope. As he pulled, her body writhed, twisting against the bed, her choked sobs mixing with the muffled screams of her children just down the hall. They begged for their mother, but the monster inside Dennis would not listen to the cries and begs for mercy. He had already decided their fate. He was going to kill them too. But fate intervened. The children managed to escape before he could carry out the rest of his plan, leaving Rader with only their mother's lifeless body as his trophy. And just like that, he disappeared into the night, slipping back into the mundane world where no one suspected a thing. He was still just Dennis Rader, the polite neighbor, the churchgoer, the family man. But behind closed doors, BTK lurked, waiting for his next victim. Nancy Jo Fox, who was also 25 at the time, was Dennis Rader's next prey. He had been watching her for weeks, following her routine, learning her patterns. She lived alone, an ideal target. On the night of December 8, 1977, Rader approached her home, anticipation burning in his veins. He cut the phone lines before slipping inside, a trick he used for almost every victim. Then he hid in the shadows of her kitchen, waiting. When Nancy finally walked through the door, she had no idea the nightmare lurking within. She barely had time to react before he pounced. With a gun in hand, he forced her into submission, his voice eerily calm as he ordered her to undress. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she obeyed. He bound her wrists and ankles, savoring the control. As she lay helpless on her bed, Dennis tightened a belt around her neck. He squeezed slowly, prolonging her agony. She struggled, gasped, but her fate had been sealed the moment she walked through that door. Before she died, Rader leaned in close, whispering a sick confession. He was the one responsible for the Otero murders. The following day, he called 911 from a payphone, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said, before hanging up. Nancy Jo Fox was dead, and the monster was still free. On February 10, 1978, Rader sent a letter to Wichita television station KAKE claiming responsibility for the murders. He suggested many possible names for himself, including BTK. He demanded media attention in this second letter, saying, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" A poem was enclosed titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy," a parody of the lyrics to the American folk song called "Oh, Death." In the letter, Rader claimed to be driven to kill by what he called Factor X, which he characterized as a supernatural element that also motivated Jack the Ripper, the son of Sam, and the Hillside Stranglers. He also asked for the police to send him a hidden message. In response, and with the knowledge that the BTK Killer watched Cake, police decided to flash a subliminal message during one of the station's evening newscasts for a split second. The message stated, "Now call the chief," and featured a drawing of an upside-down pair of glasses, which were found at the Fox crime scene. They hoped the message would influence the killer to turn himself in, but it was unsuccessful. In 1979, Dennis set his sights on Anna Williams, a 63-year-old woman he had become obsessed with. He waited for hours inside her home, growing more impatient by the minute. When she didn't return home in time, he was livid, his perfect plan ruined. Anna Williams unknowingly escaped death that night. His later murders grew more refined, more deliberate. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge was kidnapped from her home in 1985. Dennis Rader took her lifeless body to the church where he was a council president, posed her corpse in twisted positions, photographed her, then dumped her in a ditch. 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle had to go through a similar horror. She was strangled in 1986, lured into a false sense of security by Dennis posing as a telephone repairman. And Dolores Davis, age 62, his final known victim, was murdered in 1991, strangled with pantyhose before being dumped under a bridge. By 2004, the BTK case had gone cold. Police had no leads, no new evidence, until Dennis, unable to resist the need for attention, reignited the game himself. Between March 2004 and February 2005, he sent 11 cryptic messages to local media, taunting law enforcement and reliving the times he had made his victims suffer. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from a supposed Bill Thomas Killman, confessing to the murder of Vicki Wegerle in the year 1986. Enclosed were photographs of the crime scene and a copy of Wegerle's stolen driver's license. DNA testing of evidence from Wegerle's fingernails confirmed the BTK killer was responsible. Police began collecting DNA from hundreds of men, but no match was found. Rader continued his sick game, leaving packages at random locations. One contained a bound doll with a plastic bag over its head, mimicking Nancy Fox's murder. In one letter, he wrote, "They know nothing at all. I did it by myself, and with no one's help, I can't stop it, so the monster goes on. Good luck hunting." At the end of the letter, he suggested his own moniker by signing off, "Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." Another held a poem threatening lead investigator Lieutenant Ken Landwehr. In January 2005, he left a cereal box in a Home Depot parking lot, hoping it would be found. When it wasn't, he asked about it in his next message. This led police to review surveillance footage, spotting a man driving a black Jeep Cherokee, the same vehicle registered to Rader. But the final mistake? His own arrogance. In February 2005, Rader asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. They responded via a newspaper ad. It would be safe. Taking the bait, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a news station. Within minutes, police extracted metadata revealing it had last been edited by Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick search led them to Dennis Rader, who was the president of the church council. His Jeep sat outside his house, confirming what police already suspected. A warrant was issued, but they needed DNA proof. They obtained a PAP smear from Rader's daughter at a Kansas State University clinic. The results confirmed a familial match to the BTK evidence. With this, Dennis Rader was finally arrested. When officers approached him, one asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Without missing a beat, Dennis Rader replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Law enforcement searched his home, office, and church, seizing computer equipment, black pantyhose, and a cylindrical container. The next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams stepped before the cameras and declared, "The bottom line, BTK is arrested." After his guilty plea, Rader underwent a psychological evaluation by Dr. Robert Mendoza, a forensic psychologist. Mendoza diagnosed him with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality disorders. Rader exhibited a grandiose sense of self, an obsession with structure and order, a deep need for admiration, and a total lack of empathy. Rader's delusions of superiority made him believe he was special, above the law, a mastermind who had successfully fooled the world. He craved control, not just over his victims, but also in the courtroom, where he narrated his crimes in gruesome detail without a hint of remorse. His interview with Mendoza, intended for court use, was later broadcasted on NBC's Dateline, igniting controversy. The Kansas Attorney General sued Mendoza and his firm for breaching confidentiality, eventually settling the case for $30,000. The evaluation confirmed what the world already knew. Dennis Rader was a remorseless predator, incapable of understanding the emotional devastation he caused. On February 28, 2005, Dennis Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Initially, he entered a not guilty plea, but on June 27, 2005, he changed it to guilty, detailing each murder so proudly, like an achievement that must be appreciated by the world. At his sentencing on August 18th, he delivered a rambling 30-minute apology, which he described as an Academy Awards acceptance speech. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years. Kansas did not enforce the death penalty at the time. On his way to El Dorado Correctional Facility, he spoke casually with officers about the weather, but began to cry when victim impact statements played on the radio. Now locked away in solitary confinement, he spends his days in a small cell with minimal privileges, a fate far kinder than what he inflicted upon his victims. Dennis Rader's gruesome fantasies and inexplicable crimes has inspired countless works of fiction and true crime adaptations. Stephen King admitted that his novella called A Good Marriage, later turned into a film, was based on Rader's double life. Thomas Harris took inspiration from BTK for the character Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon. The case has been dissected in episodes of Law & Order SVU, Criminal Minds, and Netflix's Catching Killers and Mindhunter. Even music has explored his crimes, with thrash metal band Exodus writing BTK for their album Blood In, Blood Out, and Steven Wilson's haunting track Raider 2 were all inspired by the monster's ill desires and the actions he took to gratify them. But Dennis Rader's crimes do not stop here. In August 2023, authorities discovered a possibility that no one wanted to believe in. Dennis Rader may have had more victims. Investigators discovered quote-unquote possible trophies from additional unsolved cases while searching his former Park City home. The revelations led them to revisit long cold disappearances, including that of Cynthia Dawn Kinney.
He confessed to 10 murders almost 2 decades ago. He was known as BTK, a name he gave himself, short for Bind, Torture, Kill. He is currently serving life sentences at a maximum security facility in Kansas. And now there is new evidence that may connect the infamous BTK serial killer to additional murders. Arjun Casares spoke to the killer's daughter and got exclusive access to some of his diary entries and drawings.
Shortly after Kenny's disappearance, the sheriff's office received an anonymous call.
That male caller informed them that she was located in an old barn.
No evidence that lead was ever looked into. Her body was never found. But authorities are now looking at this journal entry by Rader. Bad Wash Day.
He marked that in 1976, he had murdered someone from a laundromat.
For the first time, law enforcement is revealing detailed drawings made by Rader, showing young girls tied and bound in barns.
Cynthia, just 16 years old, was last seen on June 23, 1976, at Osage Laundromat in Oklahoma. Witnesses recalled a faded beige 1965 Plymouth Belvedere pulling up before she vanished. Decades later, Sheriff Eddie Verdon connected Rader to the crime after finding an eerie entry in his writings, Bad Wash Day. It was a seemingly innocuous phrase until authorities realized that an ADT alarm system had been installed at a bank across from the laundromat the day Cynthia disappeared. Dennis Rader had been in the area working as an installer. More disturbingly, Dennis had allegedly confessed in his writings to fantasizing about kidnapping a girl from a laundromat. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, Dennis denied involvement, possibly fearing the death penalty in Oklahoma. The question remains, how many more victims of his nauseating fantasies are still waiting to be discovered? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.